So the origins of the Indo-Europeans are still very much in dispute. I'll go over a few of the theories. But the one thing that is agreed upon is they originated in the western or Pontic steppe in what's nowadays southern Russia, north of the Caucasus, so right around kind of the Astrakhan to Volgograd to Saratov to Kazan area. There's some people believe that they originated in the Upper Paleolithic, so, at some time in the last ice age, they would have been kind of roving hunter-gatherers following the large animals that were dwelling in the region at the time. A very primitive existence for sure. The animals they were hunting would have included things along the lines of the woolly rhinoceros, the musk ox, red deer, roe deer, giant deer, moose, wild goats, reindeer, steppe bison, oryx, and wild horse, as well as saiga antelopes. So some things that still exist and some that don't. Now, this would not have supported a very large population. There were perhaps a few thousand of them, if that. Their ancestry was comprised of two major components. One of them is that of the Caucasian hunter-gatherers. They're a race or population, or whatever you want to call it, that is known to have lived in the Caucasus Mountains, specifically the South Caucasus, going back to about 25,000 BC. And the other half of their ancestry was a population called the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, who traced about 75% of their ancestry to a group that lived kind of in the greater Lake Baikal area in Siberia. These groups, when they mixed, it's uncertain. It's possible it was in the last ice age. There is another belief that they mixed together in the 7th millennium BC, perhaps around 6200. We find near modern-day Astrakhan, the Volga Delta, where the Volga River feeds into the Caspian Sea. There are some settlements there that do appear around 6200 BC, and it's possible that kind of the Caucasian hunter-gatherers there mixed with the Eastern hunter-gatherers who had colonized further north up the Volga and into northern Russia. We do have sites showing that the Eastern hunter-gatherers had settled most of European Russia, all the way up to the far north by 9700 BC, actually. So, the further north you went, you got up to these Eastern hunter-gatherer populations. The populations were very fragmented at that point in the 10th to 7th millennium BC. These guys did not have agriculture. The Caucasian hunter-gatherers in the Volga Delta undoubtedly relied heavily on fishing. It would have been a very rich fishing ground, given that you have the delta there. Further north, a lot of these populations, the EHGs, we'll call them the Eastern hunter-gatherers, they would have relied, also very heavily on fishing, been based around the rivers. That's a pattern we see with a lot of these hunter-gatherers. Now, when they mixed, it's uncertain. It was definitely before 4500 BC, though. So there is this formation of this, it's called steppe by some geneticists, or it's called Proto-Indo-European by linguists. Now, there's several cultures that this population could be associated with. In all likelihood, there were several different groups that shared this kind of sort of ancestry. In the period between, 5,000, 4,000, and even into the 4th millennium BC. Whether or not these groups coalesced together or whether or not one triumphed over the other, it's unknown. More research is definitely needed, but there was kind of this, group of steppe peoples that shared roughly similar amounts of, ancestry for the Caucasian hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers who were kind of dwelling around this period. Now, the amount of Caucasian hunter-gatherer, CHG, ancestry within these steppe population actually increases, over this period. Not too much, but it ends up being kind of an even mix between the Caucasian hunter-gatherers and the Eastern hunter-gatherers by the time that the steppe people go on their great expansions. So, And they're definitely very primitive, even going into the 4th millennium. Their neighbors to the south and to the west were considerably more advanced. You have the early European farmers, population known, or one civilization known as the Cucuteni-Tropelians, was to their west. You have the globular amphora peoples to their northwest in Poland. The Cucuteni-Tropelians are in western Ukraine as well as Romania. And to their south, you have these Caucasian states like Mykop and Kura-Araxes, who dwell in the North Caucasus and the South Caucasus, respectively. And they all had agriculture. They did have some forms of metalworking. The Caucasian peoples did have a lot more metalworking, for sure, than the early European farmers did, just due to their closeness to copper mines. Now, one of the most important events that happens in the 4th millennium, the 3000s, is the invention and spread of wheel-drawn vehicles. At some point between 3500 and 3000 BC, we see the invention of the cart, that is a two-wheeled vehicle that, could be drawn by a horse or something. They weren't, or dragged by a man, alternatively. These were not advanced machines, but they were definitely an improvement from just simple manpower and having to drag everything with you. They spread. Originally, it was believed these things were invented in the steppe and spread from the steppe and the Indo-Europeans to peoples that surrounded them. There's been some new radiocarbon dating, particularly in the Caucasus, that shows these were actually simultaneous developments, or, at the very least, close enough in time that you can't tell which one invented it first in both the Caucasus as well as in the steppe. At the same time, you have the spread of horses, both in Central Asia, in the steppe, in the South Caucasus, as well as in Eastern and Central Europe. So all these different groups, even though they are very distinctive in language, in ancestry, and in technology and lifestyles, they are all developing this kind of same toolkit based around carts and horses at the same time. The populations to the west of the Indo-Europeans in the steppe, in western Ukraine, Poland, Germany, and further west all the way to Britain, they weren't pure farmers. They had shifted several hundred years before to kind of a mixed agropastoralism. They had experienced this kind of giant collapse around 3600 BC, where their formerly advanced civilizations had actually disintegrated. And part of this disintegration was you start to see a lot more fortification. From what it looks like, the centralized states of kind of 4000 to 3600 BC had collapsed and were replaced by all these tiny little chiefdoms. And these chiefdoms would all build their own fortresses. They fought endemic wars with each other. And they, since they couldn't guard their crop fields that well, it looks like they shifted to cattle herding, which on one hand probably made them healthier since they're eating meats, but on the other hand it made it so they couldn't support a large population. So the population of Europe actually fell quite dramatically between 3600 BC and 3500 BC, and it stayed that like a pretty low, maybe as little as a fifth to a quarter of the population of 3600 BC, all the way up until 3200 BC, when there's kind of a brief 300-year revival of the early European farmer civilization to the west of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. What causes this? It's difficult to say. There is some evidence of more political centralization, but whatever it was, it didn't really help them in the end. So, now why does this matter? So, the Indo-European languages, we can tell from linguistics and get a rough guess when the languages split from each other. The earliest split of a group is the Proto-Anatolian languages, of which the Hittite language is the most famous. The Hittites were people that lived in modern-day Asiatic Turkey, and I believe they're referenced in the Bible too. And they're known from history. We know their language. We have records of them, not just from themselves, but also from their Egyptian enemies, whom they fought in Syria quite a bit. Now, the Hittites, their language is the most divergent from all the other Indo-European languages. It's believed they split off from all the other Indo-Europeans as early as 3700 BC. And it's always been kind of a puzzle to people, since it's been difficult to see kind of direct influences on the Anatolia, that's Asiatic Turkey, from the steppe, and especially at that point, since the Indo-Europeans at that point, the steppe people, were so very primitive. What we do see from genetics is there's actually penetrations of Indo-European peoples into the Cucuteni-Trypillian, that's that EEF society in Romania and Western Ukraine, as early as 4000 BC, so even before the Proto-Anatolians. And there is some evidence of multi-generational slavery. There's a 9-year-old girl they found, a roughly 9-year-old girl, within a Cucuteni-Trypillian site that looked to be the grandchild of an Indo-European, who was severely malnourished and presumably died from malnourishment. That might be evidence of multi-generational slavery right there, or it could just be a coincidence. But the other samples of that site aren't nearly as malnourished as she was. So what it looks like is there were groups of Indo-Europeans that did penetrate, early on in the 4th millennium. And some of these ended up in northwestern Anatolia, around, what we remember as Troy from the Iliad and the Odyssey, as late as 3200 BC or 3300 BC, in a symbol called Kumtepa IV. And Kumtepa IV does have a noticeable amount of Indo-European ancestry. It's, from what it looks like, he and his people were likely the source of the Anatolian languages, or Hittite, into Anatolia. What it looks like, there were presumably some tribes of Indo-Europeans that migrated out west hundreds of years before their comrades would. And these guys they kind of followed the path. They avoided the Cucuteni-Trypillians, or perhaps even mixed with them, and migrated south as this kind of like Proto-Anatolian, Proto-Hittite group, eventually, crossing through Romania, crossing through Bulgaria, entering into European Turkey, and eventually crossing into Asiatic Turkey. And from there, they eventually moved to Central Anatolia and became the Hittites. One of the reasons for the lack of, or at least known lack of Indo-European ancestry within a lot of the later Hittite DNA samples might just because they diluted their ancestry so much by, migrating through all these different peoples without that much of a technological advantage. And that's not that uncommon in some things for DNA as well. You can have groups that will, the Hungarians are a very famous example. They have at most 8% of their ancestry from the original Hungarians who invaded Hungary 1300 years ago. So it's not that unusual for stuff like that to happen. So that explains the Anatolians and the Hittites, who they were and where they came from. And that was kind of the first migration of Indo-Europeans out of the steppe. Now, the Indo-Europeans, they we do know something of their religion as well as their culture, both from comparative mythology as well as archaeology. There was a thunder god. You can see him in Hinduism as Indra, and Greek mythology as Zeus. You have Thor for the Norse, Donar for the Germans. There's Perun for the Slavs. I believe there's a equivalent in Celtic mythology as well. Jupiter for the Romans. And his original name was Deus Pater, or Deus Pitar. So you can see where Zeus and Jupiter come from. And the other ones have their own, linguistic evolution as well, which makes a lot more sense. Just the Greek and Roman ones are the most obvious. They had kind of brotherhoods, similar to kind of the, like the Aztecs had their jaguar warriors, their eagle warriors. It looks like the Indo-Europeans had a equivalent maybe like a wolf warrior or a dog warrior kind of society. They would raise their dogs, like a boy or, young teenager would be given a dog to raise, and then upon his initiation to manhood, he would actually go and kill his dog. And that would initiate him into these kind of warrior societies or, roving, dog brotherhoods. And so they were very, very, very violent people. They weren't, at least at that point, before their big expansion, they weren't the most violent people, but they were, the early European farmer societies definitely had a lot of very brutal warfare going on in their society as well. In the Caucasus, it's not as obvious, but when everyone's building these fortresses with walls that are 6 meters thick, I mean, they're not just doing it for ceremonial reasons. They're, very, very scared of something that is out there. One of the sites in the Caucasus that archaeologists believe is a ceremonial site is on the top of this mountain that overlooks a river. And it's got these massive thick walls. It's got a moat that's around it. And, I mean, it's clearly a fortress. The people that built that thing were not just, you're not going to waste all your time building these giant walls, if just for ceremonial reasons. There's got to be something out there that you're scared of. So going back to the Indo-Europeans, though, there's other stuff like the Tree of Life, the Divine Twins. Those do seem to be Proto-Indo-European myths that have survived into recorded history. Of course, it's possible these are later stories that got exchanged, since the Proto-Indo-Europeans did not have a written language. I believe it's actually the Anatolian languages, Hittite, which is the first recorded mention, or the first, writing we have, with the, Mycenaean Linear B being the second, oldest. Although, of course, some parts of the Hindu holy texts, as well as Zoroaster and the Avestas, also go back into the 2nd millennium BC. So enough on the Anatolians. We're going to go on the first, so there was another Indo-European group called the Tocharians, and the Tocharians, they're known historically from 3 groups of people, one of whom was called the Kuchians, and they lived in the Tarim Basin of China, modern-day Xinjiang. So all the areas where the Uyghurs are currently having issues, there used to be these Indo-European people, and that's why a lot of Uyghurs, they still have like vaguely Caucasian features. Even to this day, you can still see people who have like, blonde hair, that kind of thing, because they still have ancestry from these Tocharian people. Now, the Tocharian people, they're believed by linguists who have split off around 3300 BC, and as a pure coincidence, and it's actually not a coincidence at all, there's this development of a culture called the Afanasyevo culture that appears in Western Mongolia at the exact same time. And they've actually done DNA sequencing of this Afanasyevo culture, and it turns out it's exactly the same as the Proto-Indo-Europeans that dwelled in, kind of the Western Pontic steppe. So several hundred years before the big kind of European or Indo-European migration and conquests, they were migrating across the steppe all the way as far as Mongolia. So that's, thousands and thousands of miles. And they, probably loaded up on their carts and went all the way over there. Now, the Tocharians or Tocharians, whatever you want to call them, they were pretty ephemeral within Mongolia. They faded away within a few centuries, as did their successors, the Chermenshuk culture, which was another Indo-European group. The locals in Mongolia seem to be unusually good at adapting kind of the Indo-European cultural innovations, whether it's milk drinking, animal herding, horse riding, all those sorts of things, unlike groups elsewhere. I think it also helped that area has large supplies of metals. Later, and this is like 1,000 years later, the area would become the source for some of the highest quality metals within Eurasia. And there's actually kind of a early Silk Road that was going on, but that's, I'm getting ahead of myself. So these Tocharians, they ended up in Mongolia. It's probable that they ended up in the Tarim Basin, either at this point or at some point later, because they didn't fade away completely. The Kuchians and their Tocharian comrades were known to exist all the way until the 5th century AD at the latest, prior to the arrival of the Uyghurs and all these other, and the Tibetans and all these other groups. The Tocharians were kind of interesting because within the historical period, they were actually part of Indic culture. They were very heavily influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism. They adopted a tremendous number of words from the Indian languages. So it's very kind of that Indian cultural sphere used to be extend far to the north from what it does today prior to the rise of Islam. So going back, though, so that's kind of the second big migration you see out of the western steppe, the Tocharians. The third migration is the first of the extremely brutal migrations, and that is the Corded Ware people. So the Indo-Europeans around 3000 BC discovered, there's actually several different theories for what happened. One of the theories is that the Indo-Europeans in this kind of grand Corded Ware expansion succeeded because there was a plague. They and the Afanasevo, Tocharian people all the way to the east are known to have kept in touch with each other through genetics. They were still mixing it with each other over that just huge range. So it's possible that they, kind of the creation of this first trans-Eurasian, all the way from Lake Baikal to the Rhine in Western Germany, connected all these diseases that people hadn't been exposed to, and as a result, the peoples all mass died off from all sorts of horrible plagues. There is no evidence that I'm aware of Black Plague in Europe at this time. However, they did find some evidence of it in Mongolia at this time. I personally don't believe in plague theory. I don't understand the arguments of the authors for why it would have only affected the early European farmer civilization, why it wouldn't have affected the peoples of the South Caucasus at the same time, especially since we know that they were in contact with the Indo-Europeans. I don't understand why it wouldn't have impacted the Indo-Europeans themselves. So, there's all that. And we do have, right around that time as well, we have written records from the Sumerians. This is around the Sumerians do remember this stuff. It's part of their king's list. The great floods in Mesopotamia around that time are recorded within, the Epic of Gilgamesh and all these other things. And I assume that if there was a giant plague, they would have remembered it. Now, one of the other theories is that the Indo-Europeans had horse riding, and they could go and fight as mounted infantry. That is, they would ride their carts, they would show up to, raid, pillage, burn, whatever, and then withdraw, whereas their enemies simply couldn't match that. I don't believe that's true either, since we know that their neighbors to the south, the east, and the west all had horses as well, which leaves, in my opinion, the best theory for the Indo-European expansion, that is, metal theory. Around 3000 BC, there's a discovery as well as the massive exploitation of an enormous copper mine in the southern Ural Mountains. And, it's enormous. They were just mining copper and converting this stuff into arsenical bronze. My personal belief is that the Indo-Europeans, and this is documented in Lyudmila Koryakova and Andrei Apimov's book, The Archaeology of the Urals in the Bronze and Iron Ages. It's part of the excellent Cambridge World Archaeology series. Strongly recommend it. They go and they discuss the massive mining of this southern copper mine and just its massive exploitation. What I think happened was the Indo-Europeans found all this metal, and they were able to outfit their soldiers with all of this metal that their rivals didn't have access to. In the Caucasus, the peoples did have more metal there, but it was definitely more of a rarity in the early European farmer civilizations to the west, as well as the peoples of Central Asia to their southeast. And with all of this kind of arms and armor they could have produced with that, that would have given them a tremendous advantage over all of their enemies. They had battle axes made of stone at this point. They also had kind of long knives made out of copper and bronze, and those would have been their main weapons in addition to bows and arrows. I do think kind of the mounted infantry theory part of it's true. I just think that the metal part was what gave them the decisive advantage. It wouldn't surprise me if they had something similar to what the Aztecs had, with the kind of clubs studded with various metals. So the corded ware, they were extremely destructive. Whatever advantage they had, whether it was just the horse, whether it was disease, or whether it was metal, they did succeed in destroying a large part of the early European farmer civilization. The Cucuteni Tropelians were destroyed. The globular amphora peoples were destroyed. The funnel beakers, who were in kind of northwestern or northern Germany, as well as the southern part of Scandinavia, were destroyed. And the Indo-Europeans, they more or less converted northern Europe into a pasture land. They were very much based out of cattle herding. They would burn forests to give more land for their cattle. And we don't actually find, there's no settlements of the corded ware people. All we have is like temporary camps and burial sites. So they're definitely very, very primitive people who did not like civilization very much. And their rivals to the south and to the west, surviving beyond the Rhine and the Danube, did have, cities, and some of these cities would have tens of thousands of people. And there was actually kind of a no man's zone between the Indo-Europeans and the surviving EEFs for this 400-year, 500-year period between 2900 BC and 2400 BC. So this conquest of kind of northern and central Europe could have taken as little, it could have been one generation, could have been as much as 5 generations. It kind of lasted from, maybe about 2950 BC until about 2800 BC. It's difficult to get more specific back at that time due to the, difficulties with radiocarbon dating things more specifically. So whatever this invasion was, it was very destructive. It's possible it was led by kind of an Indo-European Genghis Khan figure. Most of the Indo-Europeans from the sites that we have in the steppe are the R1b haplogroup. However, R1a is one of the most common, Indo-European associated haplogroups known these days. And the R1a haplogroup actually, geneticists call it a star-shaped phylogeny. That is, it expanded very, very explosively from a, very small number of, people. So it looks like there was some sort of Indo-European Genghis Khan who, just happened to carry the R1a haplogroup, and pretty much everyone who has R1a these days is his direct male line descendant. Whereas for R1b, it looks like there were, a bunch of different R1b lineages wandering around, so they're, a lot more divergent from each other. I mean, there's people in, Chadic-speaking peoples like the Hausa in Nigeria that have R1b just from, some random guy who went down south on the Nile and then ended up on the, Yellow Nile. And that was like 6,000 years ago. So R1a, definitely kind of the, haplogroup of whoever the Genghis Khan of the Indo-Europeans was. Now, that might be oversimplifying it. There is evidence of heterogeneity within the Indo-Europeans, not so much in ancestry, but, maybe they were associated in different tribes, similar to what the Mongols had prior to Genghis Khan. The single grave culture, which is one of those post-corded ware cultures in the Low Countries in northwestern Germany, actually has some Y haplogroups that are associated with those of Anatolia. So it looks like they might have come from that kind of same, Proto-Anatolian speaking tribe rather than, one of the other tribes. Some Polish geneticists looked at the corded ware peoples of Poland as well as the Baltic, and it looks like there were, kind of two separate, closely related, but, still distinctive groups. One that kind of hugged the coastline, and invaded Scandinavia. Another one that stuck kind of more to southern Poland and central Germany. Of course, it's impossible to say. These people had a very similar material culture. But it's very possible they were migrating as tribes. The Indo-Europeans in this first kind of invasion of Central and Northern Europe between 2900 and 2800 BC, they did mix with their early European farmer predecessors somewhat, perhaps a third of their ancestry, roughly 30%, 20%, did come from these early European farmers, almost exclusively women that they mixed with. It looks like there were some kind of allied tribes that survived, though. Haplogroup I2, which is very common in Scandinavia, may have been from kind of a Indo-Europe or not a non-Indo-European, like an EEF tribe that allied with the Indo-Europeans for whatever reason, and ended up being mixed in with them later. Where the I haplogroup could spread amongst the Indo-European speaking peoples. The other groups, there was a racially distinctive group of people called the Pitted Ware culture, also called the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. They were a very fishing-based people who had lived in Scandinavia for the previous few thousand years. They had recently pushed the EEF funnel beaker people out of Sweden and, largely destroyed them, and had colonized the coastal areas of Denmark. And it looks like there was kind of a Cold War going on where there's some coastal regions of Scandinavia where these kind of Pitted Ware culture people held out for several hundred years. There is one theory that the naval vocabulary and the Germanic languages, like words like boat, for instance, come from this Pitted Ware or Scandinavian hunter-gatherer or SHG people. I'm pretty agnostic, honestly. What we do know is that the Indo-Europeans entirely exterminated the Pitted Ware people. They don't have any living descendants at all. Or, if they do, it's so minimal that you can't detect it with DNA sequencing. How this happened, my guess is that the Indo-Europeans, especially as they adopted seafaring, were able to destroy these kind of Pitted Ware coastal camps and take over their ranges, especially since they had superior metals. So that's the third major migration, the Corded Ware people. Now, the Corded Ware people actually did back migrations, and they spread deep into Russia and into Central Asia. And you have one of these kind of successor groups to the Corded Ware is you have the Fatyanovo-Bolanovo culture, which is in the kind of Volga-Kama River basin, so modern-day Tatarstan, modern-day Udmurtia, modern-day Bashkiria, that whole area. And this is actually very important because this is the origin of the Indo-Iranian peoples. So the ancestors of the people who speak Farsi, Hindi, Bengali, this is their male line, or at least some of their male line ancestors came from this specific group. They did fight a lot of brutal wars with the Abashevo culture to their west. They fought with bronze axes, and there's all sorts of signs of warfare among them. It's unknown what language the Abashevo culture spoke, but the Fatyanovo-Bolanovo people are definitely, we know from their distinctive haplogroup, R1A Z93, that, they are the male line ancestors of a lot of the Iranian, Kurdish, and Indian people today. These people, they did spread into Central Asia as the Andronovo culture a few hundred years later, and eventually became the Santashta culture. The Santashta culture existed, roughly around 2000 BC, and they're best known for developing the chariot. And the chariot was a huge advantage. You could, rather than kind of riding a cart in the battle, you could actually be mounted on your horse and, ride in the battle on this platform, whether you wanted to use it to hack down people who were beneath you, or you wanted to shoot them with arrows and then run away. This definitely revolutionized warfare, and it gave the Indo-Iranian or Santashta, whatever you want to call them, people a tremendous advantage, and they, definitely conquered a great deal of stuff. We see them, looks like they spread all the way, some groups spread into Mongolia, some groups spread into Central Asia, and that's our kind of next big invasion. Now, once we get to the middle of the second, or let's go back to Europe again, though. since we're getting ahead of ourselves. So you have kind of this cult. Actually, let's go to the Armenians. So when the right when the Indo-Iranian peoples are spreading to the east, you have the Corded Ware culture in the west. You have the ancestors, the Armenians, actually go and invade the South Caucasus around 2500 or 2400 BC. They're possibly related to the Gutian peoples, who are referenced in some of the Sumerian and Babylonian. Any of you guys who are more familiar with the Middle Eastern literate history than I am could remember. But it looks like they do go and invade, largely to populate the Southern Caucasus. We know it's them because they do things that the steppe peoples would like to do. Like they would build these giant hills that called kurgans, or tumuli, as some people call them, that the Indo-Europeans love to do. They would bury their dead in there with goods and all that sort of stuff. And they converted a lot of the area into pasture land, what used to be largely, or at least was partially agricultural land. The group that there is in kind of northwestern Iran, Iranian Azerbaijan province, there is a find who might be a Gutian. He has a lot of Indo-European ancestry in him from the steppe, except he's dated like 1,000 years before, or even 2,000 years before, what we would expect. It's possible he was just thrown in a pre-existing burial ground, because this is from stratigraphic dating. They're looking at the levels of soil that he's buried under, not the radiocarbon dating. But he is in kind of the region that the Gutians were known to have dwelled in, right around that 26th century BC period. So he might be a Gutian and show that the Gutians are Indo-European, but again, it's kind of difficult to say. I do feel very confident that the Armenians, you do see them around 2500 BC. I know one of their historians in the classical period actually argued that a specific date. I think it was like 2477 BC as well. And from what it looks like in archaeology, he does appear to be correct. The Armenians have been in Armenia for the last 4,500 years, making them one of the oldest, most indigenous peoples, relatively. I mean, obviously no one's truly indigenous peoples in the entire world. These were, I believe, the Bedeni culture, I think is their name. I could look that up. Eventually they changed into the Trialeti culture and kind of fragmented. So you have all these, different successor states living within, the South Caucasus. And part of it's confusing because they did go and mix with a lot of different groups. You definitely have the Chechen-related Hurrian peoples and Urartian peoples who are kind of living in the region around the South Caucasus and Syria as well at the time. To who's who, it's difficult to say, but there were definitely some Proto-Armenian speakers there as well. So going back to the west, we're looking at Europe again. We have the Indo-European Corded Ware culture ruling Germany, the Low Countries, Scandinavia, Hungary, Poland, and Ukraine. Now, the Indo-Europeans, there's the spread of this thing called the bell beaker culture from Spain, and it spreads via the coastal routes. And the bell beakers, presumably they were just trading with people. And the Indo-Europeans actually adopted a lot of their culture. You start to see, these bell beaker pots, especially in a maritime context, start to appear everywhere. And the Indo-Europeans, they're very good learners. They start developing the most advanced boats that are known from this period in the western half of Eurasia. I can't speak for the eastern half of Eurasia. And with these boats, the Indo-Europeans go on the second kind of great series of conquests, and they overwhelm all of Western Europe and the Mediterranean within the next 200 years. Again, due to the radiocarbon dating, it's difficult to say how fast these conquests were. Did they occur in a single generation? Did they, take place in kind of multiple waves? It's hard to say. My personal belief is that there were 4 separate kind of sub-migrations within this. One of the ones is you have the bell beaker invasion of Britain, which is more or less a total holocaust. They kill about over 90% of the population, probably even more than that. The amount of ancestry that the megalithic builder peoples that preceded the Indo-Europeans in Britain contributed was perhaps as little as 68%. What that probably means is the Indo-Europeans killed almost all the population because they would have had a much smaller population, and then kind of intermarried with a handful. The Indo-Europeans, they do start to see a population boom around this time too. This expansion might have been driven by population pressure. You start to see them shift from kind of a pure pastoral lifestyle, where they're just herding cattle, and they, start going and adopting kind of a mixed agro-pastoralism where they're growing crops too. And you can see this. There's actually very cool stuff that some European archaeologists are doing where they will look at pollen samples from riverbeds, from soil layers, and from the types of pollen and the density of it, they can kind of get a rough estimate for how much of different, agricultural products are being grown, versus how much tree cover there was. It's very, very neat stuff, and you can use it as a population proxy. It doesn't work as, it works great, especially for Neolithic populations, not as well for, if you've got kind of a pastoral population, though. Generally you can feed about depending on soil and climate, you can usually feed, 8 to 20 times as many people on a purely agricultural society than you can, otherwise on like hunting and gathering. So you definitely get a population boom. From the pollen, it doesn't look like it recovered to that kind of EEF golden age population that I referenced from 4000 to 3600 BC, but it's definitely bigger than that kind of EEF revival from 3200 to 2900 BC. So it was the kind of the height of Europe's population and 1400 years. So the Indo-Europeans, you have that invasion of Britain. It looks like some groups had penetrated into the EEF states, in the 100, 200 years previous to that. It wasn't population replacement, though. You had these kind of roving male war bands that penetrated into Switzerland, parts of France, and most famously amongst the Basque people. And they spread these R1b haplogroups amongst them. It looks like they set them kind of, you'd have a war band, they would take over, set themselves up as chieftain, but there wouldn't really be population replacement on the level that there was for this kind of bell beaker Indo-European expansion. The bell beakers that invaded France replaced about half the population genetically. The bell beaker group that invaded Spain and Portugal, as well as the Balearic Islands and Sicily, replaced about 20% of their ancestry at the genetic level. The invasion of Iberia, Spain and Portugal, you do see the EEF start to build all these fortresses everywhere. It, maybe it delayed the Indo-Europeans, but it didn't help them for long, given that they were pretty much, overcome in large part. Although it is possible that we do see the survival of non-Indo-European peoples in a historical period. You have like Tortesos. The Basques definitely survived, and they're kind of mountain holdfasts. And, I think in a large part it's due to their, Indo-European ruling class spreading kind of the benefits of Indo-European technology to them, while at the same time they, don't get overrun by the angry horde that comes after them. The spread we see of the Indo-Europeans in France, as well as in Iberia and Sicily and in the Balearic Islands, is definitely a naval expansion. The first sites where we see the Indo-Europeans are coastal sites, particular in areas where there's harbors. So it looks like there definitely was a naval component. My belief is what happened is the bell beaker invasion was kind of a mix of factors. The reasons for success were partially, of course, the superior Indo-European or bell beaker naval development, the population boom due to the readoption of agriculture. I think a lot of it was a systems collapse, though. We know from historical records from the Roman Empire, they got about a third of their revenue from external trade and another fifth of it from running Egypt as a plantation. So they were very, very reliant on the sea trade. Now, the Roman Empire, of course, relied on huge economies of scale. And these smaller kind of EEF states and statelets and chiefdoms were likely a lot more robust. But trade would have mattered a great deal to them, just like it did any kind of ancient people. Different groups would have specialized in different things. So these Indo-European naval, captains and pirates, by going and intercepting kind of the EEF ships, taking over their ports, would have crippled their tax revenues. Some of them looked like they might have had an amber-based currency, perhaps. Maybe it was flint. It's difficult to say, but it would have kind of ended, a lot of their financial system. To what extent they had one. It would have reduced their ability to trade for needed special goods, particularly metals, as well as trading for foodstuffs in events of famines. So that would have made them a lot more vulnerable to famine. And so all these things would have really, and of course you would have had this merchant class that would have been put out of business, and they would have contributed all sorts of social unrest. So these Indo-European sea pirates, they would have definitely caused a lot of problems, and it looks like the naval invasions were the way that these were mostly launched. The Mycenaean Greeks were the exception. I talked about those in the Greek lecture 2 weeks ago. They did take the land route when they invaded Greece. They were about 40% Indo-European in ancestry, so a little bit less than the French, a little bit more than the Iberian Indo-Europeans. And they actually, in the parts of Greece they invaded, they were actually held off by the Minoans, the people who were there before them, and didn't really fully mix in with the Minoans and form the classical Greeks until after the Bronze Age collapse. The invasion of Italy, we definitely have for sure the date that Sicily was conquered, for sure by 2400 to 2200 BC period, same time everything else was being conquered. Italy itself, we don't have any kind of early Bronze Age samples, unfortunately, but we do have some Indo-European samples from around 2000 and 1800 BC. So it would have been kind of the terminal date for the Indo-European conquest of northern and central Italy. And it looks like it was, somewhat similar to it looks like it was the French group specifically that did invade Italy, although of course it's possible that a related group from southern Germany or Hungary invaded. So I believe that was the same route the Huns took from France and Italy, hundreds of years later, when you've got Attila and everything. So that's kind of the bell-beaker expansion. So let's go back to our friends in the East, the chariot-riding Indo-Iranian peoples. So around kind of the mid part of the second millennium, you have all these tremendous advantages that these chariot riders have. And they go and they just wreck everyone. They overrun kind of the Bactriana-Margiana archaeological complex, this very group that was very distinct in race and ancestry and all this other stuff. They had a kind of organized realm that was homogenizing the different tribes under the kind of BMAC, that's the Bactriana, Margiana archaeological complex. And, they were destroyed. It was very much a Genghis Khan type invasion. And you have kind of the split between the Indo-Iranian peoples, or the Iranian peoples, who end up invading modern-day Iran. And you have the Indo-Aryan peoples who actually split into two branches. One of those branches goes and it invades India. They're the Aryans. And the other branch actually goes all the way to Syria. And it's actually Syria where we have some of the earliest references to, the religious features of what we know as Hinduism. And what it looks like is this group of Aryan chariot riders set themselves up as the kings of this Hurrian-speaking state called Mitanni in northern Syria. And, they practiced a, kind of divergent form of Hinduism. They kept their names and culture, even though they ended up speaking the Hurrian language. And Hurrian is possibly distantly related to the Chechen language, most famously. The Chechens are kind of a remnant of a once much greater population. But I'll have to go into that in a different lecture. So when the Indo-Aryans invaded India, that particular branch, there were a lot of different groups. You have the Indus River Valley civilization. You have a lot of different, very distinctive groups that were, or I guess somewhat distinctive groups that were dwelling, in the Ganges, on the Indus, all that other stuff. and it looks like they conquered them in parallel, not in a sequence. So that's why you do have, even today, there's a fair amount of distinctiveness between the different Indian groups and between the different castes. I'm not an expert, though. A lot of the stuff is unfortunately terribly understudied, due to difficulties. Unfortunately, though, I hope that will change. We can get a better idea of the timing, extent, and what exactly happened in kind of the Indo-European invasion of India. Going back to Mongolia, you have you have 3 separate Indo-European groups that kind of moved there, and they're all kind of ephemeral. You have the what looks to be the ancestors of the Huns or Xiongnu go and pretty much destroy all of them, and eventually you have the Mongolic-speaking ancestors who probably came from the Amur River Basin in Manchuria, who go and eventually overcome everyone else in the classical period. So that's why there's no more Indo-Europeans in Mongolia. The Indo-Iranian peoples within kind of Eastern Europe and Central Asia did remain there. For hundreds and hundreds of years, you have the Scythians, you have the Sarmatians, and they existed even in the classical and historical period. When kind of the big change you have is the Bronze Age collapse. You have, by the end of the Bronze Age, you have all these cultures, from, the Indus River Valley to East Africa to Finland to Britain, they're all kind of interlocked in this giant, exchange of metals, precious goods, foodstuffs, very much like an early globalized society. And for a variety of reasons, according to Eric Klein, the writer of 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed, you have the systems collapse where there's kind of this world war between the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, and the other peoples of Mesopotamia. And since the Eastern Mediterranean was the center of the world at that point, all of the trade routes that are based out of there collapse, and you have civilization is kind of ends everywhere. You have areas in the Ural Mountains where, and as well as the Don Basin, in southern Russia, where people just forget how to use metals altogether and they go back to using stone and bone. The Indo-Europeans, very early on, in their conquests of Europe, adopted the megalithic, you just build giant stones and circles, that kind of thing, culture of the early European farmers. They would even bury their dead in it, and they actually expanded the, stone circles. Like Stonehenge, even though it was built by the EFs, for instance, had a lot of expansions added on to it by the Indo-Europeans. These stone circles, you start to see them abandoned. In the Bronze Age collapse, you actually have this Stone Age tribe called the Gamayun culture. So, you have this very primitive tribe seeing this evidence of this once much greater realm, and they go ahead and restore it. You also see, around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, the migration of the Uralic peoples west. You have one of the very earliest refugee populations as the Indo-Europeans expanded north into the kind of the Kama River Basin. That's modern-day Udmurtia and Tatarstan, and this is, like 2900 BC, going back to the beginning of our talk. You have these eastern hunter-gatherer populations called the Volosovo culture people. And they were very ethnically distinctive. They were hunter-gatherers. No one knows what language they might have spoken. But they actually were pushed by these kind of metal-carrying Indo-European invaders all the way to the north into the Pechora River Basin, right by the Arctic Sea. And they lived there for the next 1,500 years up until the ancestors of the Sami people went and invaded. And it looks like they did mix somewhat with the Sami people, but, by the large part, they were wiped out. So it ended very, very sadly for them. They got wrecked by 2 separate expansions. Now, kind of the Uralic expansion in the far north, they had a unique toolkit that enabled them to survive in the far north, and these people were definitely very distinctive from the Indo-Europeans in the early days. They were more advanced in a lot of ways than the Indo-Europeans, especially by 2000 BC. You have this thing called the Sima Turbino phenomenon, where you had these populations that were kind of nomadic. They, would have like sleds and stuff as they could cross the snow, or sledges, I should say. And they actually had very, very advanced weapons, more advanced than anything the Indo-Europeans had, since they had access to the Sion Mountains and the Altai Mountains, which had these tin mines, which gave them a much higher quality of bronze. And this is actually an interesting pattern we see in a lot of the Bronze Age, where you have these very marginal populations in mountains that are actually not that large. And yet, since they have access to these metals, they're able to experiment with them and become a lot more culturally advanced than their much larger neighbors, in the agricultural regions. Which is, again, why I think metal theory is the correct theory for the Indo-European expansion. In Mesopotamia, we see that the most advanced metalworking cultures are not the urbanized societies of the Tigris and Euphrates. It's the Southern Caucasus. For the early European farmers, the most advanced metalworking isn't the early European farmers. It's the Indo-Europeans and the Southern Urals. For the Indo-Europeans, you have all these widespread steppe peoples, that rule over these huge realms, and it's not them who's the most advanced. It's these, Sima Turbino, like Proto-Uralic and, other peoples who are, getting the tin and everything from the Sion Mountains that are actually inventing a lot of these technologies. So I know that was kind of out of order. I hope that at least you guys all learned something. I'll now open this up for questions. You should have to request to be able to speak, and then I will approve you. I'm going to do it one by one, so don't be offended if, I don't approve you immediately. And of course, I just want to say, I'm not a professional at this by any means. If I've messed up on anything, feel free to let me know. I won't be offended.